hello, and welcome. Find a comfortable spot. Let the day's worries drift away like clouds on a summer afternoon, and let's journey back in time together. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with a family that is, in many ways, just like any other. There's a father who has his favorites, a mother with a fierce protective instinct, and two brothers who couldn't be more different if they tried. Their story is one of love, of ambition, of breathtaking deception, and ultimately, of a journey toward becoming something more than they ever thought they could be. This is the story of Jacob, the man whose name meant supplanter, the man who would one day wrestle with God himself. But that comes much later. Our story begins much earlier, under the wide, starry skies of the Negev, in the quiet encampment of an old, blind patriarch named Isaac. Imagine the scene, if you will. The tents are made of dark goat hair, stitched together by hand, sturdy against the wind and the sun. By day, the heat shimmers off the pale, dusty ground, and by night, the air grows cool, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the distant, earthy smell of the flocks. This is the world of Isaac, son of Abraham, inheritor of a promise so vast it was like trying to count the stars in the night sky. But Isaac, in his later years, was a man whose world had grown small and dark. His eyes, which had once seen the angel of the Lord stay his father's hand on Mount Moriah, were now clouded over, dim with age. He could no longer distinguish the shape of a mountain on the horizon or the face of the sun who stood before him. His world was one of touch, of sound, and especially of taste and smell. And Isaac loved his firstborn son, Esau. He loved him with the simple, straightforward affection of a father for a son who was his mirror image in spirit, if not in looks. Esau was a man of the outdoors, a force of nature. From birth, the story goes, he came out red and covered in hair, as if he were already wearing a hunter's cloak. He grew into that image perfectly. His skin was permanently tanned by the sun, his hands calloused from the bow and the spear, and he always seemed to carry the scent of the open field with him, a mix of dry earth, wild herbs, and the thrill of the hunt. When Esau came home, he brought with him not just stories of his adventures, but tangible proof, savory wild game. And for Isaac, whose days were now spent in the quiet dimness of the tent, the taste of that venison was more than just food. It was a taste of the wild, a connection to the strength and vitality of his youth. And so, the scripture tells us, Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau. It was a love that was honest, simple, and centered on the satisfaction of the senses. On the other side of this family portrait was Rebekah, Isaac's wife. If Isaac was passive and lived in the sensations of the present, Rebekah was sharp, forward-thinking, and lived with the weight of the future. Years and years ago, before her twin sons were even born, she had felt a tumultuous struggle within her womb. It was so violent, so unsettling, that she had cried out to God, asking, "Why is this happening to me?" And the answer she received had shaped her entire life, carving a path in her heart that would define her every action. The Lord had told her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. The older will serve the younger. These words were not just a prophecy to Rebekah, they were a directive, a divine blueprint. From the moment the twins were born, Esau first, red and hairy, and then Jacob, his little hand grasping Esau's heel as if trying to pull him back, Rebekah knew her purpose. Her love was for Jacob. Jacob, whose name literally meant he who grasps the heel, a name that would soon take on the meaning of supplanter or deceiver. He was the younger, the one destined for greatness. He was not a man of the field. The scripture calls him a quiet man, dwelling in tents. You can almost picture him, smooth-skinned, thoughtful, perhaps a bit of an introvert. He stayed close to the camp, close to the routines of domestic life, and close to his mother. Where Esau was all action and instinct, Jacob was all observation and thought. And Rebekah nurtured this. She saw in him the mind of a patriarch, the careful deliberation of a leader, while in Esau she saw only the impulsive heart of a hunter. Her love for Jacob was as fierce and strategic as Isaac's love for Esau was simple and sensory. And so the stage was set. A family divided by favoritism, living under the shadow of a prophecy. Isaac and Esau, bound by taste and tradition. Rebekah and Jacob, bound by a divine promise and a quiet, shared ambition. For years, this delicate, tense balance held. The 2 boys grew into men, each walking his own path, their differences becoming more pronounced with every passing season. Esau would spend his days roaming the hills, his mind on the track of a gazelle, while Jacob would be learning the intricate politics of the clan, the management of the flocks, and the stories of his grandfather, Abraham. One lived in the physical world, the other in a world of legacy and potential. It was only a matter of time before these 2 worlds would collide, and the quiet tension in Isaac's camp would erupt in a way that would change their lives and the course of history forever. The first tremor, the first real crack in the foundation of their family, came on a day that seemed like any other. It was a day of scorching heat, the kind that makes the air itself seem to ripple. Esau had been out in the field, as he so often was. But on this day, the hunt had not gone well. The animals were scarce, hiding from the oppressive sun. He had tracked for hours, his muscles aching, his throat parched, his stomach a hollow, gnawing pit. He was a man who lived by his physical strength, and right now, every fiber of his being was screaming with exhaustion and hunger as he trudged back towards the familiar sight of the dark tents of his family's encampment. His shoulders slumped in defeat. A smell reached him. It wasn't the usual smell of roasting lamb or baking bread. This was something different. It was rich, earthy, savory, and deeply comforting. It was the smell of home, but amplified. It pulled him forward, his feet moving faster. The source of the aroma was his brother's tent, and there was Jacob, the quiet man, the tent dweller, tending a large pot that simmered over a low fire. Inside was a thick, bubbling stew. It was a beautiful, deep red-brown color, made from lentils, but clearly enriched with herbs and oils that Jacob, with his patient and precise nature, had blended perfectly. Esau stumbled towards him, his voice raspy from dust and thirst. "Quick," he gasped, pointing a trembling finger at the pot. "Let me have some of that red stuff. That red stuff there. I'm about to die." He was, of course, being dramatic. He wasn't literally about to die. But in that moment, to a man as governed by his physical appetites as Esau, it felt like it. His hunger was all-consuming. It was his entire reality. The future, the past, his name, his family, it all faded into the background, replaced by the singular, overwhelming need for that stew. Jacob looked up from his pot. He saw his brother, the great hunter, reduced to a state of primal need. He saw the dust caked on his hairy arms, the sweat matting his red beard, the desperation in his eyes. And in that moment, an opportunity presented itself. An idea, perhaps long dormant, now surfaced with startling clarity. Jacob's mind worked differently from Esau's. Where Esau saw a bowl of stew, Jacob saw a fulcrum, a point of leverage that could shift the destiny of their family. He responded, his voice calm, almost shockingly so in the face of his brother's frantic hunger. "First," Jacob said, looking Esau directly in the eye, "sell me your birthright." The words hung in the hot, still air between them. The birthright. To a firstborn son in that culture, the birthright was an immense treasure. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a sacred inheritance. It entitled him to a double portion of his father's wealth, but more importantly, it conferred upon him the spiritual leadership of the clan. He would become the patriarch, the head of the family, the one responsible for carrying on the covenantal promise God had made to his grandfather, Abraham. It was a position of immense honor and responsibility. Esau stared at his brother. For a moment, he might have been confused. The birthright. What was Jacob talking about? He could smell the stew. He could practically taste it. His stomach cramped with emptiness. What was this abstract concept of a birthright? It was something for the future, for after their father was gone. It was about flocks and herds and authority that he didn't have yet. It was a vague, distant idea. But the hunger was real. It was here. It was now. "Look," Esau said, with a wave of his hand, a gesture of complete exasperation. "I am about to die. What good is the birthright to me?" It's a line that reveals everything about Esau's character. He was a man of the immediate. He couldn't see past the current moment's discomfort. The future inheritance was meaningless compared to the present agony of his empty stomach. He truly believed, in his gut, that the stew was more valuable in that instant than the entire future leadership of his people. To him, it was a perfectly logical transaction. He was trading something useless and intangible for something vital and real. But Jacob knew the true value of what was being discussed. He knew this couldn't be a casual agreement. It needed to be sealed. It needed the weight of an oath to make it binding, to transform Esau's impulsive words into an irrevocable fact. "Swear to me first," Jacob insisted. His quiet demeanor was now steel. He would not lay ladle out a single spoonful until the deal was done. Esau, likely without a second thought, raised his hand. He swore the oath. He formally, and in the sight of God, relinquished his rights as the firstborn. He transferred his entire future, the legacy of Abraham and Isaac, to his younger brother. And for what? For a bowl of lentil stew. As soon as the oath was sworn, Jacob fulfilled his end of the bargain. He gave Esau bread, and he ladled a generous portion of the steaming red stew into a bowl. Esau took it and devoured it. He didn't savor it. He didn't thank his brother. He simply ate and drank with the single-minded focus of a starving animal. And when he was finished, he wiped his mouth, stood up, and walked away, his hunger sated, his mind already moving on to the next thing. The Bible tells us that in doing this, Esau despised his birthright. It wasn't that he felt malice toward it, it's that he held it in such low esteem. It had no weight, no value in his world. He had traded a diamond for a piece of bread and felt he had gotten the better deal. Jacob was left there, standing by his now famous pot of stew, holding a birthright he had not been born with. He now possessed the right to his father's primary blessing and inheritance. But it was a right held in secret, a legal claim that had no physical reality. His father still loved Esau. The world still saw Esau as the firstborn. Jacob had the title, but not the territory. He had won the first move in a long and complicated game, but the game was far from over. He had acted with cunning, but his actions had also sown a seed of deception that would soon grow into a thorny, tangled tree, wrapping itself around the heart of his family. The quiet man had made his move, and the silence in the camp would not last for much longer. Years passed. Life, as it does, settled into a new, albeit more fractured, routine. The incident with the lentil stew was likely never spoken of again. For Esau, it was a forgotten transaction, a moment of weakness he had long since put behind him. For Jacob, it was a secret he held close, a legal document tucked away in his heart, waiting for the day it could be cashed. During these intervening years, the paths of the two brothers diverged even more sharply. Esau, in his characteristic impulsiveness and disregard for the traditions of his family, did something that caused his parents deep and lasting sorrow. At the age of 40, he married. This would normally be a cause for celebration, but Esau chose his wives not from his mother's kin back in Paddan Aram, as was the custom for his family line, but from the local Hittite women. He married Judith, daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and also Basemath, daughter of Elon the Hittite. For Isaac and Rebekah, this was more than just a minor disappointment. It was, as the scripture says, a source of grief. Imagine the tension in the camp. These new women brought with them different customs, different ways of thinking, and most importantly, different gods. The family of Abraham was set apart for a unique purpose, to carry the knowledge of the one true God through the generations. Esau's choice of wives was a clear signal that he did not share this vision. He was assimilating, blending in with the people of the land, diluting the very heritage he was supposed to lead. For Isaac, It was a deep sadness, a failure of his firstborn to understand his role. For Rebekah, however, it was something more. It was confirmation. It was proof that Esau was unfit for the blessing. He had the brawn of a leader, but none of the spiritual discernment. He was squandering his legacy, not just for a bowl of stew, but for the sake of momentary attraction. Her resolve to see the prophecy fulfilled, to ensure that the covenant passed to Jacob, hardened like clay in the sun. Meanwhile, Jacob remained in the tents. He remained unmarried, the dutiful son, the one who stayed close, the one who listened. He watched his brother's life unfold, and he watched his father grow older and more frail. Isaac's blindness, once a partial dimming, now became a total and impenetrable darkness. His world shrank further, becoming a small circle of familiar sounds and smells within his tent. He became a man living in his memories, and his strongest memories were tied to the taste of the savory food his firstborn son brought him from the hunt. And so we come to the day when Isaac felt the cold whisper of his own mortality. He felt that his time was short, that the end of his journey was near. He knew there was one last, great duty he had to perform as patriarch, to bestow the blessing. This wasn't just a saying of nice words, a pat on the back. In his worldview, the spoken blessing of a patriarch was a conduit of real power. It was prophetic, binding, and irrevocable. It was the formal transfer of the covenant, the prosperity, the authority, and the divine favor from one generation to the next. And in his mind, there was only one person to give it to, his beloved firstborn, Esau. He called for him. Esau came, dutiful as ever when his father summoned him. Isaac's voice was thin, papery with age. "I am now an old man," he said, "and I don't know the day of my death. Now then, get your equipment, your quiver and bow, and go out to the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food I like, and bring it to me to eat, so that my soul may give you my blessing before I die." It was a sacred, final request, a last communion between a father and his favorite son. Esau, of course, immediately agreed. This was his element. This was how he showed his love. He would go and perform this final act of service for his father and return to receive the reward he had been born to inherit. He strode out of the tent and into the fields, his mind set on the hunt, completely unaware that he was leaving the door wide open for the greatest deception of his life. For someone else had been listening. Hidden by the heavy flaps of the tent, holding her breath, was Rebekah. Every word from her husband's mouth had been like a blow to her heart. Isaac was about to do it. He was about to defy the will of God. He was about to give the blessing, the one that carried the weight of nations, the one that God himself had promised to the younger, to Esau. All her years of waiting, of trusting the prophecy, were about to be undone by her husband's love for a good meal. Panic gave way to a steely, desperate resolve. There was no more time for waiting, no more time for hoping that things would work themselves out. If God's will was to be done, she would have to become the instrument of that will, no matter the cost. As soon as Esau was out of sight, she flew into action. She summoned Jacob. Her voice was low and urgent, crackling with intensity. "Look," she said, "I overheard your father say to your brother Esau, 'Bring me some game and prepare me some tasty food to eat, so that I may give you my blessing in the presence of the Lord before I die.' Now, my son, listen carefully and do what I tell you." Jacob, the quiet man, the observer, was now being thrust onto center stage. He looked at his mother, her eyes burning with a fervor that was both inspiring and terrifying. "Go out to the flock," she commanded, "and bring me 2 choice young goats, so I can prepare some tasty food for your father, just the way he likes it. Then you take it to your father to eat, so that he may give you his blessing before he dies." The audacity of the plan was staggering. It was a conspiracy born of desperation and faith. She was proposing that Jacob impersonate his own brother, lie to his blind father, and steal the single most sacred inheritance of their family. Jacob hesitated. He was his mother's son, cunning and ambitious, but this was a terrifying risk, and his objection, when it came, was very telling. He didn't say, "Mother, this is wrong. This is a lie. We cannot deceive my father." No, his objection was entirely practical. It was based on the fear of being caught. "But my brother Esau is a hairy man," Jacob stammered, "and I'm a man with smooth skin. What if my father touches me? I would appear to be a trickster to him, and would bring down a curse on myself rather than a blessing." He wasn't worried about the morality of the act, but the consequences of failure. He saw the flaw in the plan, the one sensory detail they couldn't easily fake: the touch. His father's world was one of touch, and the difference between his own smooth skin and Esau's famously hairy arms was a chasm they could not cross. Rebekah's response was swift and absolute. She would not be deterred by logistics. She looked her hesitant son in the eye, and with a force that swept away all his objections, she said, "Let the curse fall on me, my son. Just do what I say. Go and get them for me." It was an incredible statement. She was willing to take the full spiritual weight of the sin upon herself. She was placing herself between Jacob and any divine retribution. With that, she took away his last excuse. She had assumed all the risk. All he had to do was obey. And so, with his heart likely pounding in his chest, a mix of fear and exhilarating ambition, Jacob went. The next hour was a whirlwind of clandestine activity. Jacob ran to the flock, his mind racing. He selected 2 of the best young goats, their coats soft and their meat tender, just as his mother had instructed. He brought them to her, and she, a master of her craft, began to work. She knew exactly the herbs, the spices, the method of cooking that would replicate the taste of wild game. She knew the precise way Isaac liked his food. The tent filled with an aroma so savory, so deceptively authentic, that it could fool anyone, let alone a man who could no longer see what was being placed before him. While the meat cooked, Rebekah moved to the next, most crucial phase of the plan, the disguise. She went to where Esau's belongings were kept and took out his best clothes. These were not his rough, everyday hunting garments, but the special robes he would wear for important occasions. She handed them to Jacob. As he put them on, a wave of unfamiliar sensations must have washed over him. The clothes were too big, hanging loosely on his slider frame, and they carried a smell. It was the unmistakable scent of Esau. It was the smell of the open field, of dry dust and wild things, a scent so potent and unique that it was almost a part of his brother's identity. Jacob was literally cloaking himself in the essence of his brother. Then came the most bizarre and ingenious part of the disguise. Rebecca took the skins of the young goats they had just prepared. She carefully wrapped the soft, hairy skins around Jacob's smooth hands and on the smooth part of the back of his neck. It must have felt absurd, itchy, and deeply wrong. He was wearing a costume of lies, pieced together from goat hair and stolen clothes. He was no longer Jacob, the quiet man of the tents. He was a fabrication, a walking, talking deception, about to perform the most difficult role of his life. Rebecca handed him the steaming, delicious-smelling food and a flask of wine. She looked at her son, now dressed as his brother. Her work was done. The rest was up to him. "Go," she must have whispered, giving him a final, firm push. And Jacob, taking a deep breath that filled his lungs with the alien scent of Esau, turned and walked toward the dark entrance of his father's tent. The air inside was heavy and still. It smelled of old age, of fragrant oils, and of the quiet anticipation of a dying man. Isaac was lying on his mats, his unseeing eyes turned toward the tent flap, waiting. Jacob's footsteps were tentative, so unlike the confident stride of Esau. "My father," Jacob said. His voice, he hoped, was steady. Isaac stirred. "Here I am," he answered, his own voice frail. Then the crucial question, "Who are you, my son?" The lie had to be spoken. The first of many. Jacob cleared his throat, trying to summon a boldness that he did not feel. "I am Esau," he said, the words feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. "Your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game, so that your soul may bless me." Isaac was silent for a moment. Something was not quite right. A flicker of suspicion entered his mind. "How did you find the game so quickly, my son?" he asked. It was a reasonable question. A proper hunt took time. Jacob had to think fast. He had to build upon the lie. And in his haste, he did something audacious. He invoked the name of God as part of his deception. "The Lord your God gave me success," he replied, his voice dripping with a false piety that must have cost him dearly. But Isaac's doubts were not so easily quieted. The voice, it didn't sound right. It was too high, too soft. It lacked the gruff, booming quality of Esau. His world was one of senses, and his senses were sending him conflicting signals. He needed more proof. He needed to touch. "Come near so I can touch you, my son," Isaac said, his request sending a jolt of pure terror through Jacob. To know whether you really are my son Esau or not. This was it. The moment of truth. The one flaw in the plan that Jacob himself had pointed out. He had to move. Slowly, Jacob shuffled closer to his father's side. He could hear the shallow, ragged breathing of the old man. He could feel the heat radiating from his frail body. Then, Isaac's hand, thin and trembling, reached out into the darkness. It found Jacob's arm and then his hand. The fingers, gnarled with age but still perceptive, ran over the hairy goat skin. They moved from his hand up to his neck, feeling the rough texture there. Jacob held his breath. His entire future hung on this single, tactile investigation. Isaac let out a sigh, a sound of profound confusion. He pulled his hand back. He spoke the words that would echo through the ages, a perfect summary of his bewilderment. "The voice is Jacob's voice," he murmured to himself, "but the hands are the hands of Esau." His mind was a battlefield of warring senses. The evidence of his ears fought against the evidence of his hands, and the evidence of his nose, which was now catching the scent of the wild field on the stolen clothes, tipped the balance. Still, a seed of doubt remained. He had to ask one more time, a final, direct plea for the truth. "Are you really my son, Esau?" he asked, his voice filled with a plaintive uncertainty. And Jacob, now so deep in the deception that there was no turning back, summoned his last reserve of courage and told the final lie. "I am." That was enough. The doubt, for the moment, was overcome. "Bring me your game to eat, my son," Isaac said, his voice now filled with relief and anticipation, "and I will give you my blessing." Jacob served his father. He watched as the old man ate the goat meat his mother had so expertly prepared, believing it to be the fruit of Esau's hunt. He watched him drink the wine. Isaac's mood lifted. He was content. He had enjoyed his final savory meal. The time had come. "Come here, my son, and kiss me," Isaac said. Jacob leaned in. As he drew close, the scent of the clothes, the scent of Esau, enveloped the old man. It was the final, convincing piece of evidence. This was his son. This was Esau. Isaac drew his son close and kissed him. Then, taking a deep breath, he began to speak. The words of the blessing filled the dark tent, not as a mere wish, but as a declaration of reality, a shaping of the future. "Ah, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed," he began. "May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed." It was done. The blessing of dominion, of prosperity, of authority over his own family had been given. The irrevocable power had been transferred. Jacob, the younger, now held the blessing of the firstborn. He had it. He had everything. He pulled away from his father. He could not get out of that tent fast enough. Heart hammering against his ribs, the scratchy goat skin chafing his neck, he backed away, picked up the empty dishes, and slipped out into the cool night air, a thief who had just stolen a kingdom. He was a whirlwind of emotions, relief, terror, guilt, and a dizzying, terrifying triumph. He had won, but the price of his victory was yet to be calculated. The timing of it all is what makes the story so breathtakingly tense. The ink was not yet dry on the spoken blessing. The echo of Isaac's words still hung in the air of the tent when a new figure appeared at the camp's edge. It was Esau. He was triumphant, his step buoyant. The hunt had been successful. He carried with him the proof of his skill and his love for his father. He entered the camp, his voice booming, full of cheerful energy as he prepared the meat, just the way his father loved it. He worked with a happy heart, thinking only of the profound moment to come, the culmination of his life as the firstborn son. He was about to receive the blessing, the official seal of his identity. With the savory dish prepared and a skin of wine in hand, he strode to his father's tent. He pushed aside the flap and entered the familiar darkness, his voice full of affection. "My father, sit up and eat some of my game, so you may give me your blessing." From the mats, Isaac's voice came, but it was thin and confused. "Who are you?" Esau must have laughed, thinking his father was joking. "I am your son," he said heartily. "Your firstborn, Esau." A profound and terrible silence fell upon the tent, and then Isaac began to shake. It wasn't a small tremor. The scripture says he trembled violently. It was a deep, convulsive shudder that racked his entire aged frame. It was the physical manifestation of a dawning horror. The pieces clicked into place in his mind, the voice that sounded like Jacob, the suspicious speed of the hunt, the feel of the hands. He had been deceived. He had been utterly and completely fooled. The blessing, his most sacred possession, had been given to the wrong son. Who was it then? Isaac's voice was a choked whisper, filled with rage and disbelief. Who was it that hunted game and brought it to me? I ate it all just before you came, and I blessed it. He paused, and his next words fell like stones, sealing the fate of his family. And indeed, he will be blessed. It was final. What was done could not be undone. A blessing, once spoken, was out in the world, a spiritual reality that could no more be recalled than a word can be unspoken. When Esau heard this, the truth crashed down upon him with the force of a physical blow. The cheerful joy drained from his face, replaced by a contortion of disbelief and agony. And then he let out a sound that the Bible describes as a great and exceedingly bitter cry. It was the sound of a man's world shattering. It wasn't just the loss of wealth or power. It was the theft of his identity, the betrayal by his own brother, the loss of his father's ultimate sign of love. Everything he thought was his, everything he was, had been stolen from him in an act of calculated deception. "Bless me," he cried out, his powerful voice breaking with sobs. "Bless me too, my father." Isaac, still trembling, could only state the devastating truth. "Your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing." The name. It all came back to the name. Isn't he rightly named Jacob? Esau spat out the word, his grief now curdling into a white-hot rage. The name Jacob sounded like the Hebrew word for supplanter or deceiver. He has deceived me these 2 times. First he took my birthright, and now he's taken my blessing. Then his anger dissolved back into desperate pleading, a child's cry to his father. "Haven't you reserved any blessing for me?" He searched his father's face, hoping for some comfort, some reversal, some leftover grace. But Isaac's words offered little hope. "I have made him lord over you," Isaac said. his voice heavy with the reality of the words he himself had spoken. And I have made all his relatives his servants, and I have sustained him with grain and new wine. So, what can I possibly do for you, my son? Esau would not give up. You have only one blessing, my father. Bless me too, my father. And he wept. The great hunter, the strong man of the field, was reduced to tears, his body shaking with racking sobs. Moved by his son's profound grief, Isaac did what he could. He gave Esau a blessing, of a sort. But compared to what Jacob had received, it was like a shadow next to the sun. It was a prophecy of hardship. Your dwelling will be away from the earth's richness, away from the dew of heaven above. You will live by the sword, and you will serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will throw his yoke from off your neck. It was a blessing of conflict and struggle, a life of violence far from the prosperity promised to Jacob. The only glimmer of hope was a distant promise of future rebellion. It was cold comfort. Esau had asked for bread and been given a stone. He left his father's tent a changed man. The simple, carefree hunter was gone, replaced by a man nursing a deep and murderous hatred. His grief had found an object. His pain had found a name. He didn't rage and storm about the camp. His hatred was colder, more patient than that. He said to himself, in the quiet of his own vengeful heart, "The days of mourning for my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." He would wait until Isaac was dead, and the formal mourning period was over. And then he would have his revenge. Rebekah, ever watchful, ever listening, heard the whispers. She learned of Esau's cold vow. Her perfect plan, her great victory, had soured in an instant. She had secured the blessing for her beloved Jacob, but in doing so, she had signed his death warrant. The prophecy was fulfilled, but the cost was the potential murder of one son by the other. The panic she had felt before was nothing compared to the terror she felt now. Once again, she summoned Jacob. Her tone was no longer one of command, but of frantic urgency. "Your brother Esau is consoling himself with the thought of killing you," she said, the words stark and terrible. "Now then, my son, do what I say. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran. Stay with him for a while, until your brother's fury subsides, when your brother is no longer angry with you and forgets what you did to him. I'll send word for you to come back from there. Why should I lose both of you in one day?" She saw the terrible future clearly. Esau, a murderer, would either be killed in retribution or be forced to flee himself. She would lose both her sons. The thought was unbearable. Her plan was to send Jacob away, but she couldn't tell Isaac the real reason. She couldn't admit that her deception had brought the family to the brink of bloodshed. So, with the same cunning she had used to orchestrate the theft of the blessing, she devised a cover story. She went to her husband, her face a mask of wifely concern and frustration. "I'm disgusted with living because of these Hittite women," she said to Isaac, referring to Esau's wives. "If Jacob takes a wife from among the women of this land, from Hittite women like these, my life will not be worth living. It was a masterful manipulation, playing on a grief that Isaac already felt deeply. And it worked. Isaac, a man now seemingly resigned to the strange and terrible turns his life had taken, a man perhaps too weary to argue, agreed. He called for Jacob. What happened next is truly remarkable. Isaac, the man who had been so horribly deceived, now looked upon the son who had deceived him and gave him another blessing. This time, it was not given in darkness or confusion. It was given in the full, sober knowledge of who Jacob was. He commanded Jacob not to marry a Canaanite woman, but to go to Paddan Aram, to the house of his uncle Laban, and to find a wife from among his own people. And then he formally and intentionally conferred upon Jacob the highest blessing of all. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you become a community of peoples. May he give you and your descendants the blessing of Abraham, so that you may take possession of the land where you now reside as a foreigner, the land God gave to Abraham. In this moment, Isaac accepted it all. He accepted the deception. He accepted the transfer of the birthright. And he accepted Jacob as the legitimate heir of the covenant. He confirmed with his own mouth what had been stolen by trickery. He was aligning himself, at last, with the prophecy Rebekah had held onto for so long. And so, after a final, perhaps strained, farewell, Jacob left. He walked out of the encampment that had been his entire world. The quiet man of the tents was now a fugitive in the wilderness. He had nothing but the clothes on his back, a staff in his hand, and a head full of blessings he had not earned. He was leaving behind a blind, heartbroken father, a furious, murderous brother, and a fiercely loving mother whom, though he did not know it at the time, he would never see again. The sun was setting behind him, casting a long shadow on the path ahead. His old life was over. A new, uncertain, and terrifying journey had just begun. Welcome back. Settle in and let the quiet of the night surround you. We left Jacob at a precipice, a young man stepping out of the only world he had ever known, pushed from the nest by a perfect storm of his own making. He was a fugitive, but a most unusual one. He carried no stolen goods, only a stolen blessing. His pockets were empty, but his head was full of his father's prophetic words. He was Jacob, the supplanter, the quiet man of the tents, and he was now utterly and completely alone, facing the vast, unforgiving wilderness with nothing but a walking staff and the clothes on his back. His journey was not just a flight from his brother's wrath, but a painful, necessary journey toward himself. Imagine that first night. The sun, which had been his companion all day, finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant, fleeting shades of orange and purple before surrendering to the deep, star-dusted indigo of the desert night. The familiar sounds of the camp, the gentle bleating of sheep, the low murmur of conversation, the crackle of the communal fire were gone. They were replaced by an unnerving silence, punctuated by sounds that were alien and threatening. The whisper of the wind as it snaked through rocky outcrops, the distant, mournful cry of a jackal, the scuttling of some unseen creature in the scrub brush. For a man who had spent his life surrounded by the fabric of family, this solitude was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that threatened to smother him. He walked until his legs ached, putting as much distance as he could between himself and the life he had just shattered. The ground beneath his feet was hard and uneven, a stark contrast to the soft, well-trodden earth of his father's encampment. Every shadow seemed to hold the shape of his brother, Esau. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper his name in accusation. Guilt and fear were his only companions. He replayed the scene in his father's tent over and over in his mind. The feel of the scratchy goat skins on his hands, the smell of Esau's clothes, the tremor in his father's voice, the final, devastating lie, "I am." And then the echo of Esau's great and bitter cry, a sound that would haunt his dreams for years to come. What had he done? He had the blessing, yes. His mother had assured him it was God's will. His father had even confirmed it before he left. But here, in the cold, stark reality of the wilderness, it felt less like a divine inheritance and more like a terrible burden. The words of the blessing promised him dominion, prosperity, and a legacy as vast as the stars above him. But he felt like none of those things. He felt small, fraudulent, and terrified. He was a lord with no subjects, a man of riches with no food, an heir to a promised land sleeping on the unforgiving earth. He was a walking contradiction, and the weight of it was immense. The days that followed blurred into a grueling routine of survival. This was Esau's world, not his. He, the man of careful thought and quiet observation, had to learn the harsh, practical lessons of the wild. He learned which plants hinted at the presence of water. He learned to read the sun to find his way north, toward the distant land of Haran, where his mother's brother lived. He learned to build a small fire for warmth, and to bank it carefully so it wouldn't attract unwanted attention. His smooth hands, accustomed to the familiar textures of the tent and the flock, became calloused and scraped. His body, used to the gentle pace of life in the camp, ached with a fatigue so deep it settled in his bones. He was being stripped of his old self, layer by layer, by the relentless forces of the wilderness. He was a thinker, a planner, and so his mind was never idle. During the long hours of walking, he wrestled with the tangle of his life. He thought of his mother, Rebecca. Her fierce, all-consuming love had been both his shield and his sword. She had pushed him toward this destiny, assured him it was right, and taken the curse upon herself. He clung to the memory of her conviction, like a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. It was the only thing that kept him from believing he was entirely a villain. He missed her terribly. He missed the easy comfort of her presence, the unspoken understanding that had always existed between them. And he thought of his father, Isaac. He pictured the old man in his dark tent, his world shattered by the betrayal of his wife and favorite son. There was a deep and profound sadness in that. But he also remembered his father's final blessing, the one given in the full light of knowledge, the blessing of Abraham. That was a different kind of anchor. It suggested that despite the ugliness of the deception, something true and divinely ordained was at work. Perhaps he wasn't just a trickster. Perhaps he was, however unworthily, a part of a much larger story. This was the state of Jacob, a churning mix of fear, guilt, loneliness, and a fragile, nascent hope as he journeyed on. He traveled for many days, leaving the familiar territory of the Negev behind, pressing ever northward. And then, one evening, as the sun was once again beginning its descent, he arrived at a place that looked no different from any other he had passed. It was just a place, a field strewn with limestone rocks, silent and unremarkable. But his journey for the day was over. He was tired, his body crying out for rest. There was no inn, no shelter, no friendly tent to welcome him. There was only the land itself. He found a rock, a simple, smooth stone, probably warmed by the last rays of the setting sun. He took it and placed it where his head would be. It was a pillow of stone, a humble resting place for a fugitive. As he lay down, pulling his cloak tightly around him against the coming chill, he was at the absolute nadir of his existence. He had never been more alone, more destitute, more uncertain of his future. He closed his eyes, surrendering to an exhausted sleep, completely unaware that he was lying on the very threshold of heaven. And then he dreamed. This was no ordinary dream, no jumbled replay of the day's anxieties. This was a vision, vivid and overwhelming, that seemed more real than his waking life. In his dream, the stony ground beneath him became the foundation for a magnificent structure. The Hebrew word is sulam, and we often translate it as a ladder, but it's better to imagine a great ramp or a grand celestial stairway. It was immense, a solid bridge of light and substance that stood upon the earth, its top reaching all the way into the unfathomable depths of the heavens. It connected the world he knew, the dusty, lonely ground where he slept, with a world beyond his comprehension. And the stairway was not empty. It was a bustling thoroughfare of divine traffic. Angels, beings of pure light and power, were ascending and descending upon it. They moved with purpose, coming down from the heights of heaven on their divine errands, and returning up the great ramp, their tasks completed. The image was one of incredible dynamism. It was a stunning revelation for Jacob. This desolate place, which he had thought was the epitome of God-forsaken emptiness, was in fact a nexus point. It was an airport for angels, a hub of constant and furious activity between the earthly and the divine. He thought he was alone, but he was sleeping in the middle of Grand Central Station. As he marveled at this sight, his gaze was drawn upward to the very top of the great stairway. And there, standing above it all, was a figure. The brilliance was overwhelming, but the presence was unmistakable. It was the Lord. God himself was not distant, not an abstract concept, not a far-off deity. He was right there, present and attentive, at the very gate of heaven, looking down at the fugitive sleeping on his stone pillow. And then God spoke. The voice was not a sound that entered Jacob's ears, but a truth that resonated in the very core of his being. "I am the Lord," the voice declared, "the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac." The first words were a profound comfort. This was not a strange desert spirit or a local deity of this stony place. This was the God of his family, the great and awesome God who had called Abraham out of this very land of Haran generations ago. The God who had walked with Isaac in his moment of complete dislocation. God was giving him a place to stand, anchoring him in his own lineage. He was not a disconnected drifter. He was the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham. And their God was now his God. "The land on which you are lying," God continued, "I will give to you and your descendants." Imagine the impact of these words. The land on which he was lying. This hard, uncomfortable, rocky piece of ground that was his only bed, this very land was part of his inheritance. God was transforming his place of misery into a place of promise. He was not a trespasser here. He was the future owner. Then the promise expanded, echoing the one given to his grandfather. "Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south." Jacob, the lonely fugitive with not a single child to his name, was being told he would be the father of a nation so vast it would be like the dust of the earth, innumerable, covering the land. The sheer scale of it was impossible to grasp. And the promise wasn't just for him. It was for the whole world. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. He, the deceiver, the heel grabber, was being declared the unlikely channel of God's blessing to all of humanity. Then, the promise became intensely personal. It came down from the grand sweep of history and focused directly on the terrified man sleeping on the ground. This was the part that Jacob needed to hear most of all. "I am with you," God said, "and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I am with you." 3 words that changed everything. He was not alone. The God of the universe, the Lord of the angel-trafficked stairway, was personally committing to be his companion and his guardian. On the dangerous road ahead, through the strange land of Haran, in the face of all the unknown fears that awaited him, he would be watched over. And not only that, but God promised to bring him back. His exile was not permanent. There was a return ticket. He would see this land again. And then came the final, unbreakable seal on the promise. "I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." It was an unconditional, unilateral covenant. God did not say, "If you do this, then I will be with you." He simply said, "I will be with you. I will do what I have said." It is a settled fact. For a man whose life was built on trickery and negotiation, this pure, unmerited grace was a completely new category of experience. And then As suddenly as it began, the vision was gone. Jacob's eyes snapped open. He was back in the cold, pre-dawn darkness. The great stairway was gone. The angels were gone. The presence of God was gone. But the feeling, the overwhelming sense of awe and terror, remained. It coated the very air he was breathing. He sat up, his heart pounding. He looked around at the familiar, ordinary rocks and scrub brush, but he was seeing them with new eyes. This was not just a place. This was a holy place. "Surely the Lord is in this place," he whispered, his voice trembling. And I did not know it. It was a staggering admission. All his life, he had known of God, the God of his father. But he had thought of God as being somewhere else, in the formal blessings, in the stories of the past. He had never imagined that God could be here, in this random, desolate spot in the middle of nowhere. He had stumbled into sacred territory without even realizing it. The thought filled him with a holy dread. He got to his feet, a profound fear gripping him. "How awesome is this place," he said. The word awesome here doesn't mean great or cool. It means full of awe, terrifyingly, breathtakingly holy. This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. He understood. The dream wasn't just a dream. It was a pulling back of the curtain, a glimpse into the true nature of reality. He had been sleeping at the doorway between heaven and earth. As the first light of dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky a soft gray, Jacob knew he could not just walk away from this place. He had to mark it. He had to respond. He took the stone he had used for a pillow, that humble, mundane object that had been sanctified by his dream, and he stood it on its end, making it a pillar, a monument. He then took the small flask of oil he carried, oil used for anointing or perhaps for cooking, and he poured it over the top of the stone, consecrating it as something set apart for God. It was a simple, spontaneous act of worship, the first he had ever initiated on his own. And he gave the place a name. It had been called Luz, but he would call it something new. He would call it Bethel, the house of God. But Jacob was still Jacob. He was the son of Rebekah, the man who had bought a birthright and tricked his father. He was a transactional man. He had just received a promise of pure, unconditional grace, but his response was characteristically conditional. It was a negotiation. He was ready to make a deal with this awesome God. He stood before his newly anointed stone pillar and made a vow. "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking," he began, laying out his terms. "And if he will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, the basic necessities of survival, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God." It's an almost comical bargain in the face of the majestic promises he had just received. God had promised him a nation and a blessing for the whole world, and Jacob was responding with, "Okay, let's see if you can get me some bread and a new tunic, and then we'll talk." He continued his vow, "And this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth." It was the vow of an immature faith, to be sure. It was the response of a man who still saw God as a more powerful version of himself, a being with whom one could bargain and strike a deal. But for all its conditionality, it was a profound step forward. For the first time, Jacob was not just passively receiving a blessing or running from a curse. He was actively engaging with God. He was responding. He was making a commitment, however flawed. He was taking his first tentative step out of the shadows of fear and into the light of a personal faith. The deceiver was beginning the long, slow process of learning to trust. The house of God was established, not just in the field of Luz, but in a small, guarded corner of Jacob's own heart. When Jacob continued his journey that morning, he was a different man. The Bible says he lifted up his feet, an expression that suggests a new lightness, a new energy in his step. The landscape was the same. The sun was just as hot. The road ahead was just as long and dangerous. He was still a fugitive, still alone, but he was no longer simply running from something. He was now journeying towards something. He was walking under an open heaven, under the watchful eye of a God who had promised to be with him. The fear that had been his constant companion was now tempered with a quiet, powerful hope. The journey was still arduous. It stretched for weeks, taking him across rivers and through lands where he was a stranger. He left the familiar hills of Canaan and entered the vast, flat plains of Aram. He was still learning the hard lessons of self-reliance, but now a new element was added. He was learning the first lessons of God-reliance. Each time he found a source of water, each time he found safe shelter for the night, he must have remembered the promise, "I will give you food to eat and clothes to wear." The journey was no longer just an ordeal, it was becoming a testimony. God was keeping his end of the bargain. He was shedding his old self with every mile. The smooth-skinned man of the tents was becoming leaner, harder, more resilient. He was a man being forged in the crucible of the wilderness, shaped by solitude and divine promise. He was slowly, painfully, growing into the blessing that he had stolen. He was becoming a man who could be the father of a nation. Finally, after a journey that must have felt like a lifetime, he arrived. He came to the land of the Eastern peoples, the region of his ancestors. And one day, looking out over the plains, he saw a familiar, welcome sight, a well. It wasn't just any well. It was clearly the social and economic heart of the local pastoral community. 3 large flocks of sheep were lying on the ground nearby, waiting. And covering the mouth of the well was a huge, heavy stone. Jacob, a man who understood the rhythms of shepherding, walked up to the men who were tending the flocks. He was no longer the timid, fearful boy who had fled Beersheba. He was a seasoned traveler, confident enough to initiate conversation with strangers. "My brothers," he said, a friendly and respectful greeting. "Where are you from?" "We're from Haran," one of them replied. Haran. The name must have sent a jolt of relief and excitement through him. After all these miles, all these weeks, he had made it. He was in the right place. He pressed on, his voice eager. Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? Nahor was Abraham's brother, so this was the correct lineage. Yes, they said, we know him. Jacob's heart leaped. He was so close. Is he well? He asked. The Hebrew word shalom meaning more than just health, but peace and prosperity. He is well, the shepherd replied, and then added, with a timing so perfect it could only be providential. And look, here comes his daughter Rachel with his sheep. Jacob turned and saw her. A young woman, striding confidently across the field, leading her flock. She was a shepherdess, not a pampered daughter of a wealthy man, but a capable, strong woman at work. For Jacob, who had spent so long in the company of his own anxieties, the sight of her, a beautiful young woman who was his own flesh and blood, a living link to the mother he so desperately missed, was an overwhelming vision of hope and homecoming. Before she arrived, his practical side took over for a moment. He looked at the shepherds lazing around the well. Look, he said, it's still the middle of the day. It's not time to gather the flocks. Why don't you water your sheep and go let them graze? The shepherds explained the local custom. We can't, one said, gesturing to the well. We have to wait until all the flocks are gathered. Then we can roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep. The stone was too heavy for one or two men to move. It required a communal effort. But Jacob wasn't listening to excuses. His eyes were fixed on the approaching figure of Rachel. And when he saw her, the daughter of his mother's brother, and the sheep of his uncle Laban, something inside him snapped. A surge of adrenaline, fueled by weeks of pent-up emotion, and the sheer, explosive relief of this moment coursed through him. He walked over to the well. He didn't wait for the other shepherds. He didn't ask for help. With a great surge of strength he didn't know he possessed, he single-handedly rolled the massive stone away from the mouth of the well. The other shepherds must have stared in astonishment. This stranger, who had just appeared out of nowhere, had done the work of several men all by himself. He then took the watering trough and began to water the flock of his uncle Laban, the flock led by Rachel. It was a gesture of service, of protection, of immediate and profound connection. When the task was done, he walked over to Rachel, who was no doubt looking at this strange, powerful man with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. He looked at her, and the dam of his carefully controlled emotions finally broke. All the loneliness of his long journey, all the fear of his brother's anger, all the guilt of his deception, and all the overwhelming joy of this reunion, it all came pouring out. He leaned in and kissed Rachel, a familial greeting. And then he lifted his voice and wept aloud. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was a loud, unashamed sob, the sound of a man who had been carrying an impossible weight for far too long and had finally found a safe place to lay it down. Through his tears, he managed to explain who he was. He was not just a stranger. He was her kinsman. He was the son of Rebekah, her father's sister. Understanding dawned on Rachel's face. This was her cousin, the one her family had likely spoken of for years. She didn't know the whole story, but she knew this was a momentous occasion. She turned and ran, leaving her flock in the care of this weeping stranger to bring the news to her father. Laban heard his daughter's report. He heard about the man at the well, the story of his identity, and perhaps even the incredible feat of strength with the stone. He didn't hesitate. He ran out to meet this nephew he had never seen. When he saw Jacob, he threw his arms around him in a warm embrace and kissed him. There, at the well outside of Haran, the welcome was complete. Laban brought Jacob to his home, and in the safety and warmth of his uncle's tent, Jacob told his story. We can imagine it was probably a carefully edited version. He would have focused on his father's blessing to find a wife from their people, on the weariness of his journey, on his desire to connect with his mother's family. Whether he detailed the full extent of his deception with the blessing and the stew, we don't know. But he told Laban enough for his uncle to understand. When the story was finished, Laban looked at him with acceptance. "You are my own flesh and blood," he declared. The words were a balm to Jacob's soul. He had a place. He had a family. He was safe. For a month, he lived with Laban, recovering from his journey, finding his place in this new household. The fugitive's desperate flight was over. He had journeyed from the threat of death into the embrace of family. He had traveled from the desolation of the wilderness to the promise of Bethel, the very house of God. He had arrived in Haran as a man no longer just running from his past, but as one walking, however tentatively, toward a future that God himself had guaranteed. Little did he know, however, that his trials were far from over. He had escaped the fury of his brother, Esau, only to land in the house of his uncle Laban, a man who would prove to be a master of deception in his own right. The supplanter, in a turn of profound irony, was about to be supplanted. "Hello again, dear friend. It's good to have you back. Let yourself sink into a state of rest as we return to our story. We left Jacob at a moment of profound relief. He had arrived at the well in Haran, a weary fugitive who had found the warm embrace of family. He was safe. The long, lonely road was behind him. He was in the house of his uncle, Laban, his mother's brother, surrounded by his own flesh and blood. For the first time since he had fled his home, he could breathe. But as we all know, safety can sometimes be a beautifully decorated cage, and the embrace of a relative can sometimes be a prelude to a shrewd and calculating bargain. Jacob had spent his life as a quiet man of the tents, but his own tent was about to become the stage for a drama of love, labor, and a kind of deep, ironic deception that would reshape his entire life. For the first month, everything was idyllic. It was a honeymoon period, not with a bride, but with a new life. Laban's encampment at Paddan Aram was not a small, quiet affair like his father's. It was a sprawling, prosperous, and bustling operation. The air hummed with activity. There were flocks and herds stretching across the plains, servants moving with purpose, and the constant energy of a thriving clan. Laban was a man of substance, a patriarch in his own right, and he welcomed his nephew with open arms and a warm smile. Jacob, for his part, was not one to sit idle. He was grateful for the sanctuary, and he set about proving his worth. He threw himself into the work, and it quickly became apparent that he was no ordinary laborer. He was his mother's son, thoughtful and strategic, but he had also been forged by the wilderness. He understood the rhythms of the flocks, the signs of the weather, the subtle art of animal husbandry. He was diligent, intelligent, and hardworking. He was, in short, an enormous asset, and his heart was full. The fear that had been his constant shadow had receded, replaced by a feeling he had likely never known. He was in love. From the moment he had laid eyes on Rachel at the well, he had been captivated. The Bible tells us she was lovely in form and beautiful, but we can imagine it was more than just her physical appearance. In her, he saw a reflection of the home he had lost. She was his mother's kin, a tangible link to the loving parent who had sent him on this journey. She was a shepherdess, strong and capable, not cloistered away in a tent, but out in the world, full of life and spirit. Her presence was a light, a promise of a future that could be happy and whole. His love for her was pure, all-consuming, and it became the sun around which his new life in Haran began to orbit. Laban, of course, saw all of this. He was a gracious host, but beneath the warm smiles and hearty welcomes was the mind of a shrewd businessman. He watched his nephew. He saw the way Jacob worked, bringing a new level of care and prosperity to the flocks. He saw the way Jacob looked at his younger daughter, Rachel, with an open and unguarded adoration. He saw a man who was not only a tremendous asset to his business, but a man who was emotionally vulnerable. A man with no wealth, no family to back him up, and no leverage. A man who was, in essence, completely at his mercy. And after a month of careful observation, the gracious host decided it was time to talk business. One evening, Laban approached Jacob, his expression one of avuncular fairness. "Just because you are a relative of mine," he said, his voice smooth and reasonable, "should you work for me for nothing? That wouldn't be right. You're a hard worker. You deserve to be compensated. Tell me, what shall your wages be?" It sounded like a generous offer, an open-ended question that empowered Jacob to name his own price. But it was a carefully calculated move. Laban knew exactly what Jacob's most prized possession was, and he knew Jacob couldn't afford it. He was making Jacob lay his own heart on the bargaining table. Jacob didn't hesitate. He was a man in love, and a man in love is often a poor negotiator. He wasn't thinking about flocks or silver or gold. He was thinking about Rachel. He looked his uncle in the eye and made an offer of breathtaking extravagance. "I'll work for you 7 years," Jacob declared, "in return for your younger daughter, Rachel." Let's pause to appreciate the magnitude of this offer. The customary bride price, the payment a groom made to the bride's family, was significant, but it was usually paid in silver or livestock. To offer 7 full years of skilled labor, the labor of a man who had already proven himself to be a master shepherd, was an astronomical sum. It was the kind of offer a man makes when he has nothing else to give, and when the prize is, to him, priceless. He was willing to bind himself in servitude for nearly a decade, all for the hope of marrying the woman he loved. Laban must have been inwardly ecstatic. His plan had worked better than he could have imagined. He was being offered an incredible windfall of expert labor for free, all in exchange for one of his daughters. He readily agreed, but listened carefully to his words. His acceptance was a small masterpiece of ambiguity. He didn't say, "Yes, it's a deal. After 7 years of work, you shall have Rachel." Instead, he said, "It's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." It was an agreement that sounded like a promise, but was not, in the strictest sense, a binding contract. It was a verbal sleight of hand that the love-struck Jacob completely missed. He heard only what he wanted to hear, that Rachel would be his. He had a goal, a purpose. His life now had a direction. He would work, and he would wait, and at the end of his servitude, he would have his reward. And so began the 7 years of labor. The Bible tells us something beautiful and poignant about this time. It says that these 7 years seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Imagine the passing of those years. 28 seasons came and went. Jacob rose before the sun and came home after dusk, his body tired but his spirit light. He wasn't just working for Laban, he was building his future. Every lamb that was born, every field that flourished under his care, was a testament to his dedication. It was an investment of love. We can picture him catching glimpses of Rachel as she went about her own work. A shared smile across the encampment. A brief conversation at the well. These small moments would have been the fuel that sustained him. He was proving himself to be a man of great patience, a man of his word. He was no longer the restless trickster who had cheated his brother out of a birthright in a moment of impulsive greed. He was now a man willing to sacrifice a significant portion of his life for something he valued. He was maturing, growing, becoming a man worthy of being a patriarch. He was happy. He trusted his uncle. He was certain of his future. He had no idea that the man he was serving so faithfully was a mirror image of his own former self, a man who saw a deal not as a bond of honor, but as an opportunity for advantage. The 7 years passed like a dream, but the morning of his awakening was going to be a nightmare. At last, the final day of the 7 years arrived. Jacob had fulfilled his end of the bargain, to the letter and beyond. He went to his uncle Laban, no longer as a supplicant, but as a man who had come to claim his wages. His words were direct and confident. "Give me my wife," he said. "My time is completed, and I want to make love to her." He had earned her. The time for waiting was over. Laban, ever the gracious patriarch, agreed. "Of course," he said. "A deal is a deal. A wedding must be prepared." He announced that he would host a great feast to celebrate the marriage of his daughter to his nephew, Jacob. He invited everyone from the surrounding community. The encampment was soon buzzing with excitement. Fires were lit for roasting meat, music was played, and the air filled with the sounds of celebration. Jacob was the man of the hour, the triumphant groom, the hero of a 7-year love story. He sat at the center of the feast, accepting the congratulations of his neighbors, his heart overflowing with joy and anticipation. He was about to be united with Rachel, the love of his life, the reward for all his patience and hard work. As evening fell and the festivities wound down, the time came for the bride to be taken to the groom's tent. The customs of the time were strict. The bride would be brought to her husband under the cover of darkness, her face and form completely obscured by a thick veil. It was a symbol of modesty, but it was also a tradition that Laban was about to exploit with breathtaking cruelty. As the camp settled into silence, Laban brought his daughter to Jacob's tent. The flaps were closed. Inside, it was dark. Jacob, his heart pounding with love and longing, welcomed the veiled, silent figure who was brought to him. He believed he was welcoming Rachel. He was about to consummate his marriage, the culmination of a love that had defined a quarter of his adult life. But the woman under the veil was not Rachel. It was Leah. Let us try, for a moment, to imagine what must have been going through Leah's mind. She was the older sister, the one the Bible describes with the single, heartbreaking phrase, "She had weak eyes." Whether this meant her eyesight was poor, or simply that her eyes lacked the sparkle and beauty of her sister Rachel's, the implication is the same. She was the plain one, the overlooked one, the unloved one. All her life, she had lived in the shadow of her beautiful younger sister, and now her own father was using her as a pawn in his greedy scheme. Was she a willing conspirator? It seems unlikely. It's more probable that she was a victim, a dutiful daughter commanded by her powerful father to do something that must have filled her with a terrible mixture of shame, fear, and perhaps a tiny, desperate flicker of hope, as she was led, veiled and silent, into the darkness of Jacob's tent. She must have been terrified. She was being given to a man who did not want her, a man who loved her sister. She was starting a marriage based on a lie. And yet, perhaps she hoped that in the morning he might see her, truly see her, and that in time he could learn to love her. For Leah, this was not a night of triumph, but a night of profound and tragic sacrifice. For Jacob, it was a night of pure joy. He was with the woman he had worked for, longed for, dreamed of for 7 long years. In the darkness and intimacy of the tent, he had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. He had been deceived by his senses once before, when he had fooled his blind father with the feel of goat skins and the smell of his brother's clothes. Now, in the darkness, his own senses were deceiving him. The trickster had become the victim of a trick. The supplanter was being supplanted in his own marriage bed. And then the morning came. The first gray light of dawn filtered through the tent flaps, illuminating the scene. Jacob turned to look upon the face of his beloved wife in the light of day for the first time, and his world fell apart. The face he saw on the sleeping mat beside him was not the face of Rachel. It was Leah. The shock must have been like a physical blow, a sudden, cold plunge into ice water. Confusion, then disbelief, then a sickening, rising wave of horror. He had been cheated, fool of. The last 7 years of his life, his tireless labor, his patient love, it had all been a lie. And the irony of it all must have struck him with the force of a lightning bolt. He, Jacob, the great deceiver, who had tricked his father in a dark tent, had now been tricked in exactly the same way. He had pretended to be his brother to steal a blessing. Now, a woman pretending to be her sister had been used to steal his life's happiness. For the first time, he knew exactly how Esau must have felt. It was a bitter, painful, and deeply humbling lesson. His shock quickly turned to a righteous fury. He stormed out of the tent and confronted Laban, the man he had trusted, the man he had called family. "What is this you have done to me?" he raged. "I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Laban's response was a masterpiece of infuriating and disingenuous calm. He didn't apologize. He didn't show a hint of remorse. Instead, he cloaked himself in the mantle of cultural authority, as if Jacob were the one who was being unreasonable. "It is not our custom here," he said smoothly, "to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one." It was a pathetic excuse, a lie wrapped in a thin veneer of tradition. If this was such a deeply ingrained custom, why hadn't he mentioned it at any point during the 7 years Jacob had been working? Why had he agreed to a deal that he knew, by his own supposed custom, he could not honor? He was treating Jacob like a fool. But Laban wasn't finished. He was the master of the bargain, and he saw a way to turn this crisis to his even greater advantage. Before Jacob could even process the absurdity of the custom excuse, Laban made him a new offer. "Finish this daughter's bridal week," he said, referring to the 7-day wedding celebration for Leah. "Then we will give you the younger one also." It seemed, for a fleeting moment, like a solution. But then came the price tag. In return for another 7 years of work. It was a brilliant and diabolically cruel trap. Laban had him cornered, and he knew it. Jacob's love for Rachel was his weakness, and Laban was exploiting it to the fullest. Jacob was now married to Leah. To walk away would be to abandon Rachel forever, leaving her in the hands of this manipulative man. His love for her was too strong for that. He had no choice but to agree. He had to complete the wedding week with a wife he did not want, in order to earn the right to marry the wife he had already earned. And then he had to indenture himself for another 7 years to pay for it all over again. He had come to Haran seeking one wife, and ended up with 2 wives and a 14-year sentence of hard labor. Laban had not just tricked him, he had comprehensively and systematically fleeced him. And so, with a heavy heart, Jacob agreed. He fulfilled his marital duties for the ceremonial week with Leah, and at the end of that week, Laban, true to his word this time, gave him Rachel to be his wife as well. Jacob's tent, once a symbol of his future hope, now became a place of deep and complicated sorrow. He had the woman he loved, but he also had her sister, a constant, living reminder of the bitter deception he had suffered. He had 2 wives, 2 sisters, living under one roof, a situation that was a near-perfect recipe for jealousy, rivalry, and enduring unhappiness. The household that Jacob now presided over was fraught with tension from the very beginning. His feelings were clear, and he made no effort to hide them. The Bible tells us plainly, he loved Rachel more than Leah. This favoritism, the very same dynamic that had fractured his own childhood home, now became the defining feature of his own family. Rachel received his affection, his attention, his tender words. Leah received his duty and little else. She was the unloved wife, a constant presence in his tent, but an outsider in his heart. And here, the story takes another turn, for it seems the Lord himself took notice of the quiet suffering of the elder sister. The scripture says, when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel was barren. In a culture where a woman's worth and status were inextricably linked to her ability to bear sons, this was a profound reversal of fortunes. Leah, the unloved wife, was blessed with fertility. Rachel, the beloved wife, was cursed with an empty womb. And so began a new and painful chapter in their family life, the baby battle. The two sisters, who should have been allies, were now locked in a desperate, heartbreaking rivalry for their husband's love and for their own standing in the family, a contest that was measured in the birth of sons. Leah was the first to conceive. When she gave birth to her first son, she named him Reuben. The name itself was a cry from her lonely heart. It means, see a son. And she said, it is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now. She hoped that this child, this proof of her value, would finally earn her a place in Jacob's affections. But it did not. Soon she conceived again and had another son. She named him Simon, which means one who hears. Because the Lord heard that I am not loved, she explained, he gave me this one too. Her prayers were no longer just for her husband's love, but an acknowledgement that God, at least, was listening to her cries. Still, her longing for her husband's love was a persistent ache. When her third son was born, she called him Levi, a name meaning attached. Her hope was renewed. Now at last, she said, her voice full of a fragile optimism, my husband will become attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons. 3 sons. Surely this would be enough to bridge the gap between them. But it seems it was not. When Leah's 4th son was born, something in her had shifted. She named him Judah, which means praise. And this time, her explanation was different. She didn't mention Jacob at all. She simply said, this time I will praise the Lord. It was a moment of profound spiritual maturity. She had shifted her focus from pleading for the love of a man to offering praise to the God who had seen her, heard her, and blessed her. While Leah's tent was filled with the sounds of babies, Rachel's was filled with a devastating silence. Her barrenness was a source of deep shame and anguish. She was the beloved wife, but she was failing in her primary duty. She watched her sister, the woman she had supplanted in Jacob's heart, produce son after son, and her grief turned to a desperate, jealous rage. One day, she confronted Jacob, her voice raw with pain. Give me children, or I'll die, she screamed at him. It was the cry of a woman at the end of a rope, her identity crumbling. Jacob, caught in the crossfire of this miserable domestic war, snapped back at her, his own frustration boiling over. "Am I in the place of God," he said angrily, "who has kept you from having children?" He was powerless. He could give her his love, but he could not give her a child. That was in God's hands. Desperate, Rachel resorted to an ancient custom, the same one that Sarah, her great-grandmother-in-law, had used. She would have a child through a surrogate. She went to Jacob and said, "Here is my maidservant, Bilhah. Sleep with her so she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her." And so Jacob took Bilhah as a concubine, and she conceived. When she gave birth to a son, Rachel claimed him as her own and named him Dan, which means he is vindicated. "God has vindicated me," she declared. "He has listened to my plea and given me a son." In her mind, this was justice. Soon after, Bilhah had a second son. Rachel named him Naphtali, meaning my struggle. "I have had a great struggle with my sister," she announced, "and I have won." She saw this not as a blessing, but as a victory in a painful war. Leah, seeing that she had stopped having children herself, and not to be outdone by her sister's tactic, decided to play the same game. She gave her own maidservant, Zilpah, to Jacob. Zilpah bore 2 sons. Leah named the first one Gad, an exclamation meaning "what good fortune," and the second she named Asher, which means happy. "How happy I am," she said. "The women will call me happy." The family was growing, but it was a tangled and fractured family, built on a foundation of rivalry and pain. The situation reached a sorrowful low point in the strange story of the mandrakes. One day, Reuben, Leah's eldest son, was out in the fields and found some mandrake plants. In that culture, mandrakes were thought to be a powerful fertility aid, a kind of ancient love potion. He brought them to his mother, Leah. Rachel saw them, and in her desperation, she had to have them. "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes," she begged her sister. Leah, who had borne a lifetime of slights from her sister, saw an opportunity. Her response was bitter and sharp. "Wasn't it enough that you took my husband?" she retorted. "Will you take my son's mandrakes too?" And then she made a bargain, a raw and painful deal that showed just how commodified their husband had become. If Rachel would let Jacob sleep in her tent that night, Leah would give her the mandrakes. Rachel, desperate for the hope of fertility the plants represented, agreed. That evening, when Jacob came in from the fields, Leah went out to meet him. "You must sleep with me," she said, her words stark and transactional. "I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." And so, as a result of this sad bargain, Leah conceived again. She bore Jacob a 5th son, and she named him Issachar, which means reward. "God has rewarded me," she said, "for giving my maidservant to my husband." And after that, she bore yet another son, her 6th, and named him Zebulun, meaning honor. "God has presented me with a precious gift," she said. "This time my husband will honor me, because I have borne him 6 sons." And finally, after all the sons, she gave birth to a daughter, Dinah. Throughout all this turmoil, all this domestic warfare, Rachel had continued to pray. And at long last, the Bible tells us, God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. After years of barrenness and heartbreak, she finally gave birth to a son of her own. The joy and relief must have been immense. She named him Joseph. The name means may he add. With his birth, she said two things. First, God has taken away my disgrace. And second, she offered a prayer for the future. May the Lord add to me another son. This son, Joseph, born of the woman Jacob truly loved, would soon become his father's favorite, setting the stage for another generation of family strife. The birth of Joseph marked a major turning point. The 14 years of labor for his 2 wives were now complete. He had spent a full 2 decades in Haran. He had arrived as a penniless fugitive, and now he was the head of a massive family, 11 sons and a daughter, 2 wives, and 2 concubines. He had been cheated, manipulated, and trapped by his uncle Laban at every turn. He had lived in a home filled with the sorrow of his wives' bitter rivalry, and yet, through it all, God's promise to him at Bethel had been quietly, messily, and miraculously unfolding. The God who promised his descendants would be like the dust of the earth was fulfilling that promise in the chaotic reality of his own tent. Jacob the trickster had spent 20 years on the receiving end of deception. He had learned, through painful first-hand experience, what it felt like to be lied to be cheated, to be treated as a means to an end. The lessons were harsh, but they had changed him. He was no longer the callow youth who had fled from Beersheba. He was a seasoned man, a patriarch, hardened by labor and humbled by life. The long, ironic education of Jacob was nearing its completion. He was now ready to face his uncle one last time, not as a desperate employee, but as a man of substance, ready to claim his own destiny and finally, go home. Welcome back, my friend. Let's take a deep breath and let the day recede. Here in our corner of the world, the afternoon sun is beginning its slow descent, a reminder that every long day of work eventually gives way to the quiet mystery of the night. We return to Jacob in a similar moment of transition. He has weathered 20 long years in a foreign land, 20 years of hard labor and heartache, 20 years of being on the receiving end of the very same kind of cunning he once mastered. But those years are over. With the birth of his 11th son, Joseph, a new season has begun. The long contract is fulfilled. A deep, primal homing instinct, a yearning for the land promised to him by God on a lonely night at Bethel, has taken root in his soul. He is ready to go home. But leaving the house of Laban would prove to be just as complicated as living in it. The birth of Joseph was the catalyst. It was as if this child, born of his beloved Rachel, was the final piece of the puzzle, the signal that his time of exile was complete. He was no longer just a son-in-law living on the charity of his wife's father. He was a patriarch in his own right, the head of a small but growing tribe. He went to Laban, his posture no longer that of a desperate fugitive, but of a man ready to claim his own destiny. "Send me on my way," Jacob said, his voice firm and clear, "so I can go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and children, for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way." It was a formal declaration of independence. Laban's heart must have sunk. He was a shrewd man, and he knew a good thing when he saw it. For 20 years, his own prosperity had been directly tied to Jacob's presence. The flocks had multiplied beyond his wildest dreams. Everything Jacob touched seemed to flourish. Losing him would be a devastating blow to his bottom line. He tried to appeal to Jacob's sense of decency, his voice dripping with a practiced sincerity. "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay," he pleaded. Then he made a remarkable admission. "I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." He knew Jacob was his good luck charm, his walking, talking blessing from a God Laban didn't even worship. He couldn't let him go. So he fell back on his old tactic, negotiation. "Name your wages," Laban said, for the second time in their long history. "Whatever you ask, I will pay it." But the man standing before him now was not the same naive, love-struck boy who had offered 7 years of his life for a pretty face. This was Jacob, version 2.0, a man who had spent 2 decades earning a PhD in Labanology. He had learned from the master, and he was not about to be fooled again. He began by reminding Laban of the facts, establishing his leverage. "You know how I have worked for you," Jacob said, "and how your livestock have fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been." He was making it clear his contribution had been immense. Then he asked the poignant question of a man who has spent his life building another's fortune. "But now, when may I do something for my own household?" He then made Laban an offer, a new deal that, on the surface, sounded incredibly modest, almost foolish. It was a plan born of deep cunning, a strategy so subtle that the greedy Laban would walk right into it. "I don't want any wages at all," Jacob said, a statement that must have been music to Laban's ears. "But if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them." He laid out his proposal. "Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages, and my honesty will testify for me in the future, because when you come to check my wages, any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-colored, you can consider stolen." Laban could scarcely believe his luck. In the genetics of sheep and goats, solid colors like white and black are dominant. Speckled, spotted, and streaked patterns are recessive and therefore much rarer. Jacob was essentially offering to take only the cast-offs, the genetic oddities, while leaving the vast majority of the pure-colored, and thus more valuable, flocks for Laban. It seemed like the deal of a lifetime. "Agreed," Laban said quickly, before Jacob could change his mind. "Let it be as you have said." But Laban, being Laban, couldn't resist trying to rig the game even further in his own favor. He didn't wait for Jacob to do the separating. That very day, Laban himself went through the flocks. He meticulously removed every single male goat that was streaked or spotted, every female goat that was speckled or spotted, and every dark-colored lamb. He took every animal that carried the genes for the very patterns he had just promised to Jacob as wages. He then handed this herd over to his own sons, and he put a 3-day journey's distance between his sons' flocks and the flocks Jacob would be tending. It was a classic Laban move, a deceitful, preemptive strike. He was trying to create a genetically pure flock for Jacob to manage, making it virtually impossible for any new speckled or spotted animals to be born. He thought he had, once and for all, outsmarted his clever nephew. But Jacob had a plan. It was a strange plan, a combination of folk wisdom, keen observation, and what can only be described as creative biological warfare. He went and cut fresh branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees. Then, with his knife, he peeled back the bark in strips, creating white streaks on the green wood. He made a pile of these striped, mottled branches. Then he took his streaky sticks and he placed them in all the watering troughs, right where the flocks came to drink, and, as was their habit, to mate. The prevailing folk belief at the time was that the images an animal saw at the moment of conception would directly influence the appearance of its offspring. Jacob was banking on this. He was hoping that the sight of the striped branches would magically induce the birth of striped, speckled, and spotted young from the solid colored flock. And, to the astonishment of everyone, it worked. When the ewes and nanny goats came to drink and mate in front of the peeled branches, they later gave birth to young that were streaked, speckled, and spotted. It was as if Jacob were painting the next generation with his sticks. The flock of rejects that belonged to Jacob began to grow at an astonishing rate. But Jacob wasn't relying on magic alone. He added a layer of shrewd, selective breeding to his folk remedy. He was a careful observer. He could tell which animals in the flock were the strongest and healthiest. And so, whenever the strong, robust females came to the troughs to breed, he would make sure to lay the striped branches in front of them. But when the weaker, feebler animals came to mate, he would withhold the branches. The result was a brilliant piece of genetic engineering, pre-DNA. The weaker animals conceived and bore solid colored offspring, which belonged to Laban. But the strongest, best animals in the flock conceived in front of the branches and bore strong, healthy, multi-colored offspring, which belonged to Jacob. The outcome was a complete reversal of Laban's scheme. Jacob's wealth exploded. The man who had agreed to take only the cast-offs was now systematically breeding all the strongest animals for himself. The Bible says that the man grew exceedingly prosperous. He came to own vast flocks of his own, and with that wealth, he acquired servants, camels, and donkeys. He was no longer a dependent son-in-law. He was a powerhouse, a self-made man who had beaten the master of deception at his own game. The 20-year apprenticeship was over. The student had surpassed the teacher. Naturally, this state of affairs could not last. The atmosphere in Laban's camp, once deceptively warm, turned openly hostile. Jacob began to overhear the grumbling of Laban's sons. "Jacob has taken everything our father owned," they whispered bitterly. "He has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father." And Jacob noticed that Laban's face, when he looked at him, no longer held any pretense of friendliness. It was cold, resentful, and suspicious. The good luck charm had become a rival, and Laban did not like it one bit. The situation was becoming dangerous. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, Jacob received his final confirmation, his divine marching orders. The Lord spoke to him, the same God who had met him at Bethel. "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives," God said, "and I will be with you." It was the same promise of presence that had sustained him on his journey out, now beckoning him on his journey home. This was all the encouragement he needed. He couldn't risk having a family discussion in the main camp, where listening ears were everywhere, so he sent a secret message to Rachel and Leah, asking them to meet him out in the field where he was with his flocks. There, surrounded by the evidence of his God-given prosperity, he laid out his case. He told them everything. "I have seen that your father's attitude toward me is not what it was before," he began, confirming what they must have already noticed. He reminded them of his faithful service and of Laban's treachery. "You know that I've worked for your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. 10 times. The number was a testament to Laban's relentless duplicity. But then, Jacob shifted his focus. He didn't take credit for his own success. He pointed directly to God. "But God has not allowed him to harm me," he said. "If he said, 'The speckled will be your wages,' then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said, 'The streaked will be your wages,' then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's flocks and given them to me." He saw the hand of God in the strange science of his breeding program. And finally, he told them about the dream, about the angel of God who had revealed the plan to him and had commanded him to return to the land of his birth. He had laid out his case. Now he waited for the verdict from his wives. Would their loyalty lie with him, or with the father and home they had always known? Rachel and Leah's response was swift, united, and filled with the bitterness of their own long experience with their father. Their loyalty was now completely with their husband. "Do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate?" they asked, a rhetorical question dripping with sarcasm. "Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us." This was a stunning indictment. They saw the truth clearly. Their father had not treated them as daughters, but as commodities. He had sold them to Jacob for 14 years of labor, and instead of setting aside that bride price for their own security, as was the custom, he had absorbed it into his own wealth. They felt utterly betrayed. They had no home left in Haran. Their home was with Jacob. Their future was with him. "So do whatever God has told you," they said, giving him their unanimous and unconditional support. The decision was made. All that remained was the execution. Jacob waited for the perfect opportunity. It came when Laban took his men and went off to shear his sheep, a task that would take him some distance away from the main camp for several days. This was the moment. With swift and quiet efficiency, Jacob mobilized his entire household. He put his children and his wives on camels. He gathered all his livestock, all the possessions he had accumulated in Paddan Aram, and he began the long journey home. He slipped away like a thief in the day, not even saying goodbye. He crossed the great Euphrates River and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead, toward the border of the Promised Land. For 2 days, his escape went unnoticed. But on the 3rd day, word reached Laban. His entire workforce, his daughters, his grandchildren, and a significant portion of his wealth had vanished. His reaction was predictable, pure fury. He gathered his kinsmen, a formidable posse, and set off in hot pursuit. For 7 days, Laban and his men rode hard, closing the distance. Jacob, encumbered by a massive flock and a young family, could not move quickly. Laban caught up to him in the mountains of Gilead. He had Jacob cornered. A violent confrontation seemed inevitable. Laban, with his armed kinsmen, could have easily overpowered Jacob's camp and taken back everything by force. But God, as he had promised, was with Jacob. The night before Laban reached the camp, God intervened directly. He came to Laban in a dream, and his message was sharp and chillingly clear. Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. It was a divine restraining order. Laban could meet with Jacob. He could talk to him, but he was forbidden from harming him or even threatening him. God had effectively neutralized Laban's rage. The next morning, Laban rode into Jacob's camp, his face a thundercloud of anger. But with God's warning ringing in his ears, he had to sheathe his sword and use only his words. His speech was a masterful performance of a wronged and heartbroken father. "What have you done?" he began, his voice dripping with false injury. "You've deceived me and carried off my daughters like they were captives of war. Why did you flee secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me, so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of timbrels and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You have done a foolish thing." He let the accusations hang in the air before reminding Jacob of his superior power, a power he was now forbidden to use. "I have the power to harm you," he said, a veiled threat. "But last night the God of your father said to me, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.'" Then he finally got to the heart of what was truly bothering him, the real reason for his frantic pursuit. "I know you long to go back to your father's household," he said, his voice turning hard. "But why did you steal my gods?" Somewhere in the chaos of the departure, Rachel had done something audacious. She had gone into her father's tent and stolen his teraphim, his household idols. These weren't just decorative statues. In that culture, these small figurines could be seen as protective spirits, titles of property, or symbols of the headship of the family. To Laban, their theft was not just an insult, it was a deep spiritual and financial wound. Jacob, who knew absolutely nothing about this, was genuinely outraged by the accusation. After all the years of Laban's cheating, to be accused of theft was the final straw. "I was afraid," Jacob admitted, explaining his secret departure. "I thought you would take your daughters from me by force." Then his indignation boiled over. "But if you find anyone who has your gods, they shall not live. In the presence of our relatives, see for yourself whatever I have that is yours, and take it." It was a rash and dangerous vow, made in ignorance. Laban began his search. He went through Jacob's tent, Leah's tent, and the tent of the two maidservants. He found nothing. Finally, he came to Rachel's tent. Rachel, a true daughter of her father, had learned the art of deception well. She had taken the idols, hidden them inside her camel's saddle, and was now sitting calmly on top of them. When her father entered, she played her part perfectly. "Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence," she said, her voice full of feigned apology. "I'm having my period." It was a brilliant move. By the customs of the day, a woman in her condition was considered ceremonially unclean, and it would be a great taboo for a man, even her father, to touch her or her belongings. Laban was stopped in his tracks. He searched the rest of the tent, but he did not dare disturb his daughter. The idols remained hidden. Rachel had outwitted the fox. When the search came up empty, Jacob's dam of frustration finally broke. He unleashed 20 years of pent-up anger and resentment on his father-in-law, his voice ringing with righteous fury. He detailed the endless hardships, the sleepless nights, the relentless cheating. "What is my crime?" he demanded. "What sin have I committed that you hunt me down? This 20 years I have been with you. I have served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you have changed my wages 10 times. He concluded with a powerful testimony to his divine protector. "If the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac, had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you." Laban had no answer. He was defeated. Chastened by God's warning, shamed by the fruitless search, and silenced by Jacob's passionate tirade, he backed down. He changed his tune, suggesting they part as friends. "Let's make a treaty, you and I," he said. They took a large stone and set it up as a pillar. Then they gathered a heap of stones. It would be a monument, a boundary marker. Laban named it in his native Aramaic, Jegar Sahadutha. Jacob named it in Hebrew, Galeed. Both names meant the same thing, the heap of witness. Laban declared that this heap would be a witness between them. He would not pass it to harm Jacob, and Jacob would not pass it to harm him. He made Jacob swear one last oath, that he would not mistreat his daughters or take any other wives. They sealed their treaty with a meal, a shared sacrifice. The next morning, Laban kissed his daughters and his grandchildren goodbye. He turned his caravan around and went home. The long, tangled, 20-year chapter was finally, blessedly, over. Jacob was free. But as he watched Laban's dust settle on the horizon, Jacob knew he had only traded one fear for another. He had escaped the enemy behind him. But now he had to face the enemy he had created 20 years before. He had to face Esau. As he continued his journey, he had another one of his mysterious, supernatural encounters. The angels of God met him on the road. Seeing this heavenly host, he seemed to take courage. He named the place Mahanaim, which means 2 camps, recognizing that as he led his own earthly camp, God's heavenly camp was marching alongside him, protecting him. But even this reassurance wasn't enough to quell the terror in his heart. The memory of Esau's bitter cry and his vow of revenge was still fresh, even after 2 decades. He decided he had to get ahead of the problem. He sent messengers ahead to the land of Seir, the country of Edom, where Esau now lived as a powerful chieftain. The message he sent was crafted with exquisite humility and deference. He instructed his servants to say, "We are from your servant Jacob. I have been staying with Laban and have remained there till now. I have cattle and donkeys, sheep and goats, male and female servants. Now I am sending this message to my Lord, that I may find favor in your eyes." He called himself servant and Esau Lord. He was trying to placate his brother, to show him he wasn't coming back as a rival to claim the blessing of dominion. The messengers went, and they returned with news that was far worse than Jacob could have imagined. Their report was simple and terrifying. "We went to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." 400 men. This was not a welcome party. It was not a band of brothers coming to offer a warm embrace. It was an army. It was a war party. Jacob's blood ran cold. His worst fears were being realized. The day of reckoning had finally arrived. The Bible says he was in great fear and distress. His mind raced, and his old, strategic instincts took over. He immediately divided his entire camp, his family, servants, and flocks into 2 separate groups. It was a desperate calculation. If Esau came and attacked the first camp, perhaps the second camp would have a chance to escape. But after making his pragmatic preparations, he did something else. He prayed. And this prayer was not the conditional, bargaining vow of the young man at Bethel. This was the desperate, honest cry of a mature man at the end of his rope. He addressed God not as a distant deity, but as the God of his fathers, the God who had made him a promise. "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac," he began, "Lord, you who said to me, 'Go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper.'" He was holding God to his word. Then came the humility. "I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become 2 camps." He acknowledged that everything he had was from God. Finally, he made his desperate plea. "Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, 'I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted.'" It was a model prayer, honest about the fear, anchored in humility, and rooted in the promises of God. After he prayed, he acted. He prepared a massive gift for Esau, an extravagant gesture of appeasement. He selected over 550 animals from his flocks: goats, sheep, camels, cattle, and donkeys. He didn't send them all at once. He divided them into separate droves, and he sent each drove ahead one by one, with a space between each. He instructed the servant leading each drove, "When my lord Esau meets you and asks, 'Who do you belong to? And where are you going? And who owns all these animals in front of you?' then you are to say, 'They belong to your servant Jacob. They are a gift sent to my lord Esau, and he is coming behind us.'" It was a brilliant psychological strategy designed to soften his brother's heart with wave after wave of overwhelming generosity. That night, a deep disquiet settled over him. He could not rest. He got up and sent his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons across the Jabbok River, a tributary of the Jordan. He sent all of his possessions across as well. And then he did something strange. He remained behind, alone on the north side of the river, alone in the pitch-black darkness. And it was there, in the solitude and the darkness, that the defining encounter of his life occurred. The Bible says, "A man wrestled with him till daybreak." Who was this man? Was it an angel? A demon? A local river spirit from Canaanite lore? Or was it, as Jacob would later conclude, God himself in human form? The text is deliberately, mysteriously ambiguous. A stranger emerged from the darkness, and without a word, the 2 were locked in a desperate, grueling, all-night struggle. It was a physical battle, a grunting, straining, exhausting fight on the muddy banks of the river. But it was also clearly more than that. It was a spiritual battle, the climax of all of Jacob's striving. They wrestled for hours, a silent, relentless combat. Jacob, for all his fear, was tenacious. He would not give up. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, the mysterious stranger realized he could not overpower Jacob by conventional means. So he reached out and touched the socket of Jacob's hip, and with that single supernatural touch, he wrenched it from its joint. A searing, white-hot pain shot through Jacob's body. He was wounded, crippled, but still, he did not let go. "Let me go," the man said, his first spoken words, "for it is daybreak." Jacob, clinging to him in agony, his face streaked with sweat and grime, gave the response that was the distilled cry of his entire life's ambition. "I will not let you go," he gasped, "unless you bless me." He was no longer trying to trick his way into a blessing. He was no longer trying to work for it or buy it. He was clinging with every last ounce of his strength to the very source of the blessing itself, and he was demanding it directly. He would not be denied. The stranger then asked him a question. "What is your name?" To answer, Jacob had to confess everything he was. He had to say the name that meant heel grabber, supplanter, trickster. In that moment of profound vulnerability, clinging in pain, he spoke the truth. "Jacob," he said. And with that confession, his opponent gave him a new identity. "Your name will no longer be Jacob, the man declared, "but Israel. For you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Israel, Yisrael, he who struggles with God." His very name would now be a badge of honor, a commemoration of this night of sacred combat. His greatest weakness, his striving, wrestling nature, had been transformed into his greatest strength and his new identity. "Please tell me your name," Jacob asked, needing to know for sure who he had been wrestling. But the stranger refused. "Why do you ask my name?" he said. And then, the text tells us, he blessed him there. Jacob finally received the blessing he had been seeking his entire life, not through deception, not through labor, but through a desperate, tenacious, and faith-filled struggle. As the sun began to rise over the hills, the mysterious figure was gone. Jacob, alone again, knew what had happened. "I saw God face to face," he said in awe, "and yet my life was spared." He named the place Peniel, which means face of God. As he limped across the ford of the Jabbok to rejoin his family, the sun rose upon him. He was a changed man. He was no longer Jacob the supplanter. He was Israel, the one who had wrestled with God and prevailed. He was wounded, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his days, a permanent, physical reminder of his weakness, and of the night his striving had finally given way to a true blessing. He was now, at last, ready to face his brother. Hello once more, my friend. Here in our little corner of the world in Da Nang, the sky has softened, and a gentle afternoon rain has begun to fall. It's the kind of quiet, steady rhythm that seems to wash the world clean, a peaceful end to the week. It's a fitting backdrop for us to join Jacob in the moments just after the storm of his life. We left him on the banks of the Jabbok River as the sun was rising. He was a changed man in a way that was both profound and visible. He walked with a limp, a permanent, physical reminder of his night-long struggle. He was Jacob, but he was also now Israel, the one who had struggled with God and had, in some mysterious way, overcome. The greatest battle was over, but there was still one more to face. Across the valley, his brother Esau and his 400 men were approaching. The limp is important. It changed everything. The man who now walked to meet his brother was not the fleet-footed deceiver who had once fled from this very man's wrath. He was slower, more deliberate, physically broken. His strength was no longer in his speed or his cunning, but in the new identity that had been forged in him through pain and persistence. As he looked up and saw the dust cloud of Esau's approaching army, the fear was still there. It was a cold knot in his stomach, but it was a different kind of fear now, not the terror of a guilty man about to be caught, but the sober apprehension of a man walking into a future he could not control, a man who had to rely on something other than himself. His old strategic mind was still working. He carefully arranged his family for the encounter. He placed the handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah, and their 4 sons in the very front. They were the most expendable, the first line of defense. Behind them, he placed Leah and her 7 children, and in the very back, in the most protected position, He placed the two people who held the core of his heart, Rachel, the love of his life, and their young son, Joseph. Even now, his favoritism, the source of so much strife, was evident in his formation. But then, he did something that showed how much he had truly changed. He didn't stay behind with his beloved Rachel. He walked out in front of them all, alone. He who had been given the blessing that his brothers would one day serve him, that his mother's sons would bow down to him, now began to walk toward the brother he had wronged. And as he walked, he bowed. Not once, but 7 times, he prostrated himself on the ground, his face in the dust. It was the posture of a lowly servant before a great king, the obeisance of a vassal before his lord. In this single, profound act of humility, he was voluntarily relinquishing the stolen blessing. He was non-verbally communicating to his brother, "The dominion you believe I stole, I give it back to you. I come not as your lord, but as your servant." Across the field, Esau saw this approaching figure, this brother he hadn't seen in 20 years, bowing and limping toward him. He saw the long caravans of gifts that had been arriving all morning, wave after wave of overwhelming generosity. He saw the women and children arranged behind him. And whatever was in his heart, whatever murderous rage he had harbored for 2 long decades, simply melted away in that moment. Perhaps the years had softened him. Perhaps life as a successful and powerful chieftain had healed his wounds. Perhaps the gifts had soothed his pride. Or perhaps it was simply a miracle of grace, a divine intervention in the heart of a wronged man. The Bible tells us that Esau ran. He didn't march forward with his army. He broke into a run, his 400 men falling away behind him. He ran to meet the limping Jacob, and he threw his arms around him in a powerful embrace. He hugged his brother, the man who had ruined his life, and he kissed him. And there, in the middle of the field, with 2 households and an army looking on, the 2 brothers held each other and wept. The bitter tears of betrayal, shed 20 years before, were washed away by the warm tears of reconciliation. When their emotional reunion subsided, Esau looked past his brother and saw the crowd of women and children huddled together, watching in awe. "Who are these with you?" he asked. Jacob's answer was beautiful in its simplicity and truth. He didn't say, "These are my family," or "These are my wives and children." He said, "They are the children God has graciously given your servant." In this moment of reunion, he gave all the credit to God. Esau then met the family. One by one, the groups came forward, the handmaids and their children, Leah and her children, and finally Rachel and Joseph. And they all bowed low before him. "What do you mean by all these droves I met?" Esau asked, gesturing back toward the road where the servants were still managing the massive gift of livestock. "They are a gift," Jacob said, "to find favor in the eyes of my Lord." But Esau, his heart now full, shook his head. "I already have plenty, my brother," he said. And that one word, brother, sealed the reconciliation. It was a word of acceptance, of equality, of family restored. Keep what you have for yourself. Jacob, however, gently insisted. To him, Esau's acceptance of the gift was the final, tangible sign that he himself had been accepted. "No, please," he urged. "If I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you have received me favorably." It was an incredible statement. He was linking this moment of human forgiveness with his divine encounter the night before. Just as he had seen the face of God at Peniel and lived, he was now seeing the face of his brother and finding not death, but life. Convinced, Esau accepted the gift. The great crisis was over. Esau, ever the gracious host, suggested they travel together, that he would escort Jacob on his way. But Jacob, ever the strategist, politely demurred. He used the perfect excuse, one that was both diplomatic and true. "My Lord knows that the children are tender," he said, "and I must care for the ewes and cows that are nursing their young. If they are driven hard just one day, all the animals will die." He painted a picture of a slow, fragile caravan that couldn't possibly keep up with Esau's army. "So let my Lord go on ahead of his servant, while I move along slowly at the pace of the flocks and herds before me, and the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." It was a gentle parting. Esau accepted the excuse and offered to leave some of his men behind as an escort, an offer Jacob also politely declined. And so they parted. Esau turned back toward his home in Seir, and Jacob watched him go. The feared confrontation, the dreaded battle, had ended in a peaceful embrace. Jacob had faced his past, and he had found not vengeance, but grace. Interestingly, Jacob did not follow Esau to Seir. Perhaps he never intended to. Once Esau was gone, Jacob turned his caravan and traveled to a place called Succoth, where he built a temporary shelter for himself and his family. From there, he moved on, and finally, he arrived at the city of Shechem, in the very heart of the land of Canaan. And there, he did something incredibly significant. He didn't just camp on the land, he bought it. He purchased a plot of ground from the sons of Hamor, the local ruler, for 100 pieces of silver. For the first time, the man who had been promised the land now owned a piece of it. It was his. He pitched his tent there as a landowner, not a sojourner. And to consecrate this moment, he built an altar. He named it El Elo Israel, which means God, the God of Israel. He was publicly claiming his new name and dedicating his new home to the God who had brought him there. It seemed that after all the years of turmoil, a time of peace had finally begun. But peace, in Jacob's life, was often a fleeting and fragile thing. The years of wandering were over, but the troubles were not. His large and complicated family, now living in close proximity to the Canaanite city dwellers, was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And that spark came in the form of his only daughter, Dinah. One day, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, went out to visit the women of the city of Shechem. It was an innocent outing, a young woman's curiosity about her new neighbors, but it ended in tragedy. She was seen by the prince of the city, a young man also named Shechem, the son of the ruler, Hamor. He seized her, violated her, and shamed her. The story then takes a strange turn. Having committed this terrible act of violence, the young prince found himself genuinely infatuated with Dinah. He spoke tenderly to her and went to his father, demanding that he arrange a marriage. Hammer, seeking to make things right and to form a powerful alliance, went to Jacob and his sons with a proposal. He offered a peaceful, integrated future. Let our people intermarry, he suggested. You can live here, trade here, acquire property. We can become one people. He offered the standard restitution for the offense, a bride price for Dinah, and a path toward a harmonious coexistence. But Jacob's sons were not interested in harmony. They were filled with a cold, burning rage. Their sister had been defiled, their family honor stained. They looked at Hammer and his son, and they responded with a cunning deception that would have made their father proud in his younger days. They pretended to agree to the proposal, but they added one condition. We can't give our sister to a man who is not circumcised, they said. That would be a disgrace to us. We will enter into this treaty with you only on one condition, that you become like us by circumcising all your males. Then we will give you our daughters and take your daughters for ourselves. It was a demand cloaked in piety, but it was a trap. Hammer and Shechem, eager to secure the alliance and for the young prince to win Dinah, readily agreed. They went and persuaded all the men of their city to undergo the painful rite of circumcision. On the third day after the procedure, when the men of the city were all feverish, in pain, and at their most vulnerable, the trap was sprung. Two of Jacob's sons, Simon and Levi, full brothers of Dinah, acted on their fury. They took their swords, and in an act of brutal, premeditated vengeance, they stormed the unsuspecting city. They went from house to house and slaughtered every single man, including the ruler Hammer and his son Shechem. They rescued their sister Dinah from the prince's house and brought her home. Behind them, the other brothers, swept up in the violence, plundered the entire city, taking the livestock, the wealth, and the women and children as captives. When Jacob heard what had happened, his reaction was not one of moral outrage at the massacre. It was one of pure, pragmatic fear. You have brought trouble on me, he raged at Simon and Levi, by making me a stench to the Canaanites and Perizzites, the people living in this land. We are few in number, and if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed. He was terrified of the repercussions of a retaliatory attack from the neighboring peoples. The violent anger of his sons had jeopardized the safety of his entire family. It was a dark and bloody chapter, one that Jacob would remember with a shudder for the rest of his life. In the aftermath of this horror, God spoke to Jacob again. He called him away from the blood-stained land of Shechem. Go up to Bethel and settle there, God commanded, and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. It was a call to return to the beginning, to the place of grace, to purify himself and his family. Jacob obeyed immediately. He commanded his entire household to rid of their foreign gods. This was a significant moment. It meant acknowledging all the pagan influences they had collected over the years, including, we must assume, the household idols that Rachel had stolen from her father so long ago. They gathered up all the idols and the strange earrings associated with their worship, and Jacob took them and buried them under a great oak tree at Shechem, a final renunciation of the past. Then the entire clan traveled to Bethel. As they traveled, a terror from God fell on the surrounding towns, so no one dared to pursue them. At Bethel, the place where he had once slept on a stone pillow, Jacob built an altar, and there God appeared to him again, reaffirming the covenant, repeating the promise of a great nation, and confirming his new name. "You are Israel," God said. But this time of spiritual renewal was also marked by sorrow. Deborah, Rebekah's childhood nurse, who had been a living link to Jacob's mother and his past, died at Bethel and was buried there. And soon after, as they continued their journey south, the greatest personal tragedy of Jacob's life struck. Rachel, his beloved Rachel, went into labor. It was a hard, agonizing labor. The midwife, trying to encourage her, cried out, "Don't despair, for you have another son." But Rachel was dying. With her last breath, she named the baby boy Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. It was a name born of her final agony. But Jacob, in his own grief, could not let the boy carry such a heavy name. He immediately renamed him Benjamin, which means son of my right hand, a name of honor, strength, and favor. Rachel died there on the road, and Jacob buried her and set up a pillar over her grave, a monument to the love of his life that stands, the Bible tells us, to this day. His heart was shattered, but the journey had to continue. He traveled on until he finally reached the encampment of his aged father, Isaac, at Hebron. And there, after a long and eventful life, Isaac died at the age of 180. The two brothers, Jacob and Esau, their own conflict now a distant memory, came together one last time to bury their father in the family tomb, the cave of Machpelah. The great cycle of his own generation was now complete. Jacob, now known almost exclusively as Israel, settled in the land of Canaan, but the patriarch's life was not to be a peaceful one. The favoritism that had poisoned his own childhood now reappeared with a vengeance in his own tent. His heart, broken by the loss of Rachel, now clung to her two sons, Joseph and the newborn Benjamin. He loved Joseph more than any of his other children, and he made no secret of it. He gave the 17-year-old boy a special gift, a richly ornamented robe, a coat of many colors, a visible symbol of his preferential love. This overt favoritism, combined with Joseph's own youthful arrogance and his dreams of dominion over his family, bred a bitter, simmering hatred in the hearts of his 10 older brothers. This hatred finally boiled over on a day when Jacob sent Joseph out to check on his brothers, who were grazing the flocks near Shechem. When they saw him coming from a distance, they conspired to kill him. I will not recount the whole familiar story of Joseph in detail, but let us see it through the eyes of the grieving father. From Jacob's perspective, this is what happened. His sons returned from the field without Joseph. They brought with them that beautiful, multicolored robe, the symbol of his love, now torn and drenched in the blood of a goat. "We found this," they said, their faces a mask of false concern. "Examine it to see if it is your son's robe." Jacob recognized it immediately. The world fell out from under him. The conclusion was obvious and devastating. "It is my son's robe," he cried, his voice choked with agony. "Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." His grief was absolute. He tore his own clothes, a sign of profound mourning, and put on sackcloth. For days that stretched into weeks and months, he mourned his beloved son. All his other sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. His grief was a black hole that consumed all light. "No," he said, his voice hollow with sorrow. "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." For the next 22 years, Jacob lived as a patriarch in mourning. The vibrant, striving man was gone, replaced by an old man whose life was overshadowed by loss. He had been a deceiver and been deceived. He had wrestled with men and with God. And now, he was a father wrestling with a grief so profound he believed it would follow him to his death. Years passed. A great famine, severe and unrelenting, fell upon the whole region. The only place with food was Egypt. And so Jacob, hearing there was grain in Egypt, sent his 10 older sons on a journey to buy food to keep the family from starving. When they returned, they brought a strange and disturbing tale. They spoke of a powerful Egyptian viceroy who had accused them of being spies, who had held their brother Simon hostage, and who had demanded that they bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, back to Egypt to prove their story. For Jacob, this was an impossible demand. He looked at his sons, his heart filled with old grief and new fear. "You have deprived me of my children," he accused them. "Joseph is no more and Simon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." The thought of losing Rachel's last remaining son was more than he could bear, but the famine was relentless. Their grain ran out. The family was starving. Judah, the 4th son of Leah, who had grown into a leader, stepped forward and made his father a solemn promise. He pledged his own life for Benjamin's safety. "I myself will guarantee his safety. You can hold me personally responsible for him," he said. "If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all my life." With a heavy heart, Jacob finally relented. He sent his sons back to Egypt, with Benjamin in their care, his heart filled with dread. The wait for their return was agonizing, but when they finally came back, they brought with them news so astonishing, so impossible, that Jacob's mind could not at first comprehend it. They thundered into the camp, their voices full of excitement and disbelief. "Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all of Egypt." The Bible says Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. It was too much. The hope was too dangerous to entertain. his sons showed him the proof. They pointed to the long train of Egyptian carts that had followed them, carts laden with provisions, sent by the Pharaoh himself at Joseph's command to transport Jacob's entire household to Egypt. When Jacob saw the carts, the walls of his long-held grief finally crumbled. His spirit revived. A joy he had not felt in over 20 years flooded his being. "I'm convinced," he said, his voice filled with a wondrous, life-giving hope. "My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." And so began the final journey of the great patriarch. Israel, as he was now called, gathered his entire clan, 70 souls in all, and they began the trek from Canaan down to Egypt. At Beersheba, the last stop before leaving the Promised Land, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father, Isaac, and that night, God spoke to him one last time in a vision, calming his fears about leaving the land of the promise. "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt," God said, "for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes." It was a promise of presence, posterity, and a peaceful end. The reunion itself, in the Egyptian land of Goshen, was a flood of emotion. Joseph rushed out in his chariot to meet his father. When Jacob saw the son he had mourned as dead for so long, now a powerful prince of Egypt, he fell on his neck and wept for a long time. "Now I am ready to die," Jacob sobbed, "since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." But he did not die. He lived in Egypt for 17 more years, watching his family flourish and multiply under the protection of his powerful son. As he felt his own life drawing to a close, he performed his final duties as patriarch. He called for Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and he blessed them. In a final, beautiful act of symbolic reversal, the old man who had once stolen a blessing by trickery now deliberately crossed his hands, placing his right hand not on the head of the older son, Manasseh, but on the head of the younger, Ephraim, giving the greater blessing to the younger son. Joseph tried to correct him, but Jacob refused. "I know, my son, I know," he said. He had learned that God's choices often defy human tradition. Then he gathered all 12 of his sons around his deathbed. He gave to each a prophetic blessing, a poetic and often blunt assessment of their character, and a prophecy about the future of the tribe that would bear their name. He remembered the violence of Simon and Levi, and he blessed Judah with the promise of the scepter, the line of kingship. His final request was for his sons to swear an oath. He was not to be buried in Egypt. This land had been a refuge, but it was not his home. His home was the land of the promise. He commanded them to carry his body back to Canaan and to bury him in the cave of Machpelah, the tomb his grandfather Abraham had bought, the place where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and his own wife, Leah, were all laid to rest. And then Jacob, now Israel, drew his last breath and was gathered to his people. A great mourning was held in Egypt, and then a grand funeral procession, including the elders of Israel and the officials of Pharaoh's court, traveled from Egypt back to Canaan. They buried him in the cave, in the heart of the promised land, as he had commanded. His journey was over. The boy who had grasped his brother's heel, the quiet man who had lived in tents, the deceiver who had stolen a blessing, the fugitive who had dreamed of angels, the lover who had labored for 14 years, the wrestler who had struggled with God, and the patriarch who had wept for a lost son. He was finally at rest. He had lived a long, tumultuous, and deeply human life, full of striving and sorrow, grace and transformation. He was Jacob the supplanter, but he died as Israel, the father of the 12 tribes, the namesake of a nation, a flawed but faithful patriarch whose complicated legacy would echo through all of history.